Shades and Shapes in the Dark by Michael Kilman. Read by the author. Chapter 2. The Meadow at the Edge of the World. Ever unbidden, never forgiven, we are driven on, always pretending, never ascending, past the unending road. Open to seeing, never agreeing from what you are fleeing for. Mind your possessions, never suppression. Be careful when you unlock that door. There is nothing quite like the innocence of fast friendship in youth. For Clarissa, the girl next door, Monica, was a blueprint of the deep imprint young friendship leaves inside us. They met when they could barely form a sentence. They met first in the solitary sandbox behind Monica's house, where the parents had arranged a playdate. It was in the rise and fall of sandcastles that they built their connection. They were two girls from two different worlds. Clarissa, born with red hair, green eyes, and a face full of freckles. She had only ever known the suburb she was born into. Monica, always the shorter, with dark hair and black eyes, had been born in her father's native land of Colombia and moved to the United States to be closer to her mother's family when she was just 2 years old. Monica came from a Catholic household, keeping the rituals of the church with her parents every Sunday. Clarissa's parents pledged to agnosticism and art. Both families were friendly enough, and each girl played soccer until they were 8 and grew tired of it. Growing alongside each other, they lived more like sisters than friends. Each walked in and out of each other's house as if they had belonged there. Neither set of parents minded much. Clarissa's father died when she was 6. The loss created a strange chasm between them, though Monica never knew it. The story of her father's passing was a tale that Clarissa could not share even as her friend comforted her in the aftermath. For what words would a 6-year-old have for such a tale as that? Worse, Clarissa had seen something that night, some shape in the dark as her father took his last breaths just on the other side of the bathroom door. Because she could not yet comprehend what she had seen, and her father's death had loomed so large, the memory was forgotten until it was too late and Demon was already in pursuit. Now, at 9 years old, the only thing Clarissa understood was that her skateboard, the final gift from her father before he drew his last breath, was the center of her universe. Her first talisman to ward off her depression and her last tenuous thread to his existence. Before his passing, she would sit with her father on the porch as he smoked his pipe and read a book. Together, they watched the neighborhood kids, Margie and James, practice tricks on their skateboard up and down the street. Her father, noticing her interest, had gifted her the board, all bright yellow with purple flames licking the surface. It was Clarissa's greatest treasure. By the time Clarissa was 9, the age in which Demon solidified the contract, she could no longer remember what her father had looked like. Even when Clarissa stared at their family pictures, he seemed a stranger from another life. At the height of the summer solstice of her 9th year, Clarissa met her fate. The woods of southeastern Pennsylvania were thick, despite the city of Philadelphia carving out large swaths of forest for buildings and roads. But in the suburbs, plants and animals crept through the neighborhoods, pushing back into their ancestral territory whenever possible. In the woods, ferns clambered up to the sky between trees, and most mornings were filled with mist and dew. For Clarissa and Monica, the forest was not a place of sorrow or darkness. It was a place of light and joy. They passed countless hours dashing in and out of the trees. The creeks and tributaries to the Delaware River were filled with living treasures, and the girls uncovered turtles, caught crayfish, and sometimes tadpoles. Both girls fancied themselves tomboys and shied away from dresses. Neither of their parents minded, except Monica's on Sundays. Near the park and along the woods were 3 waterfalls. Not huge falls, nothing that would inspire a painting or a poet, but for children they were a playground. 24 large boulders jutted up out of the water at the base of the falls. In the summertime heat, when the scorching, unrelenting sun of the Philadelphia suburb would catch fire, the girls sat on the boulders and let the spray of mist gather in beads on their skin and soak their clothes. The day that Clarissa met Demon was one such summer day. It was the longest day of the year, a day when the evening twilight crept up and the veils between worlds thinned. For at the height and depths of the light of the sun, things are thinner than they would be otherwise. In that thinness lay great power, or tragedy. The two girls sat on the boulders, their legs crossed and facing one another, catching the mist on their skin and clothes alike. Monica wore her backpack, which she had wrapped lovingly in a white plastic trash bag to keep the water away from her sketchbooks and library books. Clarissa's skateboard sat on one of the other nearby boulders 12 feet below, away from the spray of the falls. She didn't want to risk a scolding from James or Margie if she rusted her bearings again. "Do you want to make a game of it?" asked Monica. Her hair was matted with sweat, mist, and sunblock. Her soft, round face, almost cherub-like, was red from the heat. "Rock hop? Again? We just played rock hop yesterday, remember? After the skate park." "I know, but what else are we going to do?" Clarissa shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe we should just go back and see if we could rent a movie and lay really still on the carpet at your house." Monica sighed. "Coolest place in the house." Clarissa nodded. "In both our houses. I wish we had an air conditioner." "Denise Snyder got a pool this summer." "She did? Seems like everyone is getting a pool but us." "Yeah, and she told me neither of us are invited." "She's such a bitch." "Language," said Monica. Monica was the peacekeeper of the two of them, and she hated conflict, but she was the smartest person Clarissa knew. "What? You know it's true, Mon. She probably doesn't even have a pool. She just wants to rub it in our face." Monica shrugged. "You staying at my place tonight?" "Can I?" Clarissa tried to keep the eagerness out of her voice. Summers were hard at home. Her new stepfather, Ted, paced through the corridors, patrolling like some warden in a prison, exerting control over everything, tidying every crumb and speck. Clarissa wasn't even a messy person. She had cleaned that house top to bottom dozens of times with her mother before Ted arrived. Her room was tidy, but tidy wasn't enough for Ted. It was his domain. Any hair out of place and he would be on you. Not shouting. He rarely raised his voice. No, Ted asked in a deep, nasally tone, if you could please be sure to clean up after yourself. If even a single sock lay on the ground, he had no patience for the messes. Even her mother wasn't exempt from his compulsion. When Clarissa's mother made her morning coffee, she couldn't leave it on the counter unattended for a single minute, or Ted would dump it out in the sink. That usually caused an argument. Coffee was the only thing keeping her mother going. Monica said, "My mom doesn't care. She's out all night anyway, and as long as we don't wake her up in the morning, she probably won't even know." "It's kind of cool your mom is a night nurse," said Clarissa. "Sometimes, but she sleeps a lot during the day, and Dad is a terrible cook." "Yeah, well, at least your dad isn't like Ted. He's so annoying." "What about your mom?" "She just lets Ted do whatever he wants. It's like... Like what?" "I don't know. Sometimes she looks at me and she just looks sad. I try to ask her what's wrong, but I don't know. It seems like she hates me and doesn't want to deal with me anymore. I mean, she tells me she loves me and stuff, but she works so much, and sometimes I feel like she almost prefers it that way, like she doesn't want to see too much of me." "I thought she was working less since Ted came around." "No, he lost his job already and only works a few hours a week for a friend who owns a plumbing company, so my mom's working 2 jobs again." "When did that happen?" 2 weeks ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I don't know. I guess I didn't want to talk about it." There it was, the rift. It was hard for Clarissa to talk about her family or home life. She didn't want to think about it when she was out with Monica. She just wanted to focus on having fun. Monica nodded and leaned forward, hugging Clarissa. The embrace lingered for a few seconds, and then, parting, Monica jumped up, the waterfalls behind her. Clarissa couldn't help but smile. Monica always seemed to know when a hug would help. Monica asked, "What movie should we rent?" "There's that one about the kids that play baseball and fight a monster. It looks kind of interesting." Monica frowned. "Baseball? Do you even care about baseball?" "They fight a monster. Monsters are cool." "It's not what it looked like to me. It looked like it was just a bunch of stupid boys." "Well, what do you want to watch?" "The Sailor Moon movie is on VHS now." "Monica, you literally dragged me to that movie 3 times when it was in theaters. I used up all my movie money from my mom seeing that one with you." Clarissa stood herself, picked up a few petals off the top of the boulder, and then threw them over Monica's head into the waterfall. She loved to see if she could disrupt the flow, to somehow change the torrent, to reshape things around her. She enjoyed it, even when she knew it was fruitless. "Dragged you? Admit it, you love Sailor Moon." Clarissa put her hands on her hips. "No, you love Sailor Moon. I only went 'cause you practically begged me." Monica raised her arms in the air and said, "Moon prison power makeup." Clarissa rolled her eyes, but couldn't suppress a smile. "How about we watch some skateboarding highlights?" Monica's smile fell. Almost whining, she said, "Isn't that tape at your house?" "No, I stashed it at yours so I don't have to watch Sailor Moon." Monica rolled her eyes. "I don't want to watch that tape again. I watch you skateboard every day." "Well, I need to study if I'm going to compete one day." "You really think you will?" "Yeah, and I'm going to win too, just like Margie." Margie lived 2 blocks over and had befriended Clarissa when her father died. She taught Clarissa everything she could about skateboarding. When she was 12, Margie had won a youth slalom competition. Monica shouted, "Hey, you! What are you doing?" Out of the corner of her eye, Clarissa saw a flash of color. She turned and saw someone crouching down on the boulder below, grabbing her skateboard. Clarissa raised her hands to her mouth and shouted, "Hey, put that down! It's mine!" The boy, a few years older than both of them, with curly dark hair and wide, suspicious eyes, froze. He looked around, not seeing the girls on the boulders just above him. Clarissa picked up a small pebble and threw it his direction. It missed, but clattered down on the rock just next to him. He looked up and caught Clarissa's eye. At first, she thought he was going to put the skateboard down and apologize. He looked at it, looked up at the girls, and then, grinning widely, said, "Finders keepers, you little dweebs!" He hopped from one boulder to the next, and after jumping across several large rocks, he dashed off into the thick of the woods with Clarissa's skateboard, the very one her father had given her, in his arms. Clarissa's heart pounded. A rush of anger and panic sent spikes of adrenaline through her. She launched into action, leaping across the boulders as fast as she could into the woods after him. "Clarissa, wait!" Monica tried to follow, but was slower than Clarissa. In a moment she had left her friend behind. She couldn't wait. She couldn't lose that board. She dashed through the woods after the boy. He was at least 3 or 4 years her senior. Despite his scrappy appearance, he was clumsy and slow. He didn't hide, he just kept running. Even in those moments when he disappeared behind the trees and bushes, she could hear the crash of his footsteps in the thick underbrush. "Get back here! That's my board, you thief!" She could hear him laughing as he kept on. "Too slow, dweeb. It's my board now." Clarissa's legs burned, and she felt out of breath, but the desire to get her board back drove her through the pain. It was the one thing in her life that made her happy when so much else was wrong. And if she lost it, if she lost the one present her father had given her before he died, her heart would break open. After long minutes of giving chase, she felt winded. She didn't know how much longer she could go on, but then, just as she thought she couldn't run anymore, the boy ahead stopped and caught his breath. Evidently, he didn't know she was still in pursuit. She ducked behind a large oak tree and waited as the boy surveyed the scene. She didn't dare stick her head out, not just yet, and besides, she could hear him if he started walking away. It was impossible to be silent, walking through so many layers of branches, leaves, and ferns. She closed her eyes, listening hard, and in several more moments she could hear the slow movement of his feet. This was her chance. The boy had thought he had lost her in the woods. Now all she had to do was sneak up behind him. Then she could knock him down and take the board before he could get back up. It didn't matter that he was bigger than her. She could catch him off guard and run before he knew what had happened. Carefully, slowly, she peered out from behind the tree. He was just on the edge of her vision, but walking away from her. He stopped every few moments and looked around, turning in different directions. She smiled. He was lost. Then her smile faltered as she realized she was lost too. He had run a long way, and he had weaved around several directions as he ran. It occurred to her that even if she were to get her board back now, she wouldn't know how to find her way back. These woods ran on for miles, though if she walked long enough, eventually she would find a river or a road. Hadn't her father always taught her that if you get lost in the woods, find a river or road and follow it? So that's what she would do. After a few more moments, the boy picked a direction and walked on. Clarissa kept up, dodging in and out of the trees and doing her best to keep as quiet as possible. She only moved when he did, so he wouldn't be able to focus on her footsteps. He stopped a few times and looked around, her skateboard still under his arm. She hid behind the trees as often as she could, and after several minutes, she almost caught up. Then she stepped on a tree branch, and the crack was so loud it made the boy turn around. He was only a few dozen feet away. Clarissa charged at him. His eyes went wide, and he turned and ran through the woods, dodging left and right around trees. But she was close now, and even though he was older, he was in worse shape than she was. All those hours on her skateboard had given her a little extra endurance. She caught up, and with all of her strength, she shoved him hard. Her hand caught on some pin or button on his jacket, and she felt a sharp pain in the center of her palm as something wet and warm flowed down her wrist. Too late, she realized she had pushed him off a hill. She saw him go over the edge and disappear. He was just gone. She heard something crashing through the brush below. Clarissa waited for several more breaths, afraid to see what she had done. Finally, she walked toward the edge and looked down. It was difficult to see between the trees and the undergrowth, but she could see someone lying at the bottom of the hill, just a hint of the colors of her skateboard nearby. Clarissa felt a pang of guilt, then anger, then guilt again. She hadn't meant to hurt him. Why had he taken her skateboard? No, this was his fault. He was the thief. He deserved what he got. She made her way down the slope. The decaying leaves from years of fall foliage were slick. Twice she grabbed a branch to keep herself from pitching forward. Each time she felt a sharp pain in her palm and left a smear of blood on the branches, but she was too focused on her task to care. The sun was close to setting now, and Clarissa knew the woods weren't safe after dark. Teenagers used the woods to party, and if they caught you out here, you'd end up with a beating or worse. The thief was probably out here meeting his friends and came a little early. Usually, the older kids didn't come down into the woods until after dark. But how had time slipped forward so quickly? She hadn't been running that long, had she? It couldn't be more than 4 or 5 o'clock. She should have plenty of time before sunset. Her father had always told her that time was strange in some of the parts of the deep woods and that she should be careful. Normally, she would have heeded his warning, but her board. She hadn't thought about what she was doing when she dashed into the woods after the thief. There was a sinking feeling growing in her stomach. Unease descended on her. Then she realized she was alone. She looked around. The forest didn't look friendly. Monica was long gone, but it didn't matter. In moments, she would take her skateboard back from the thief, and she would run back the way she came. Or at least, she would try to run back the same way she came. She couldn't be that far from the edge of the woods, could she? Philadelphia wasn't a small city. She stepped off the hill and right into a meadow. A deep chill gripped her, despite the sweat pouring down her face from the heat and her run. She couldn't put her finger on it, but this place was creepy. It felt wrong. That was when she noticed something odd at the edge of the meadow. Trees bent out and away from the center in every direction. It was almost as if someone had detonated an explosion here, and it had blown the trees outward, forcing them to regrow in strange, twisted angles. But there were no scorch marks or sign that anything was wrong. Even the leaves and branches pointed away from the center. Not one branch or leaf had the courage to grow toward the meadow. There were tufts of tall grass among the dirt, but even they seemed to bend outward. There were no birds here, nor any other sign of rabbits or squirrels. Not one flower flashed its color. The wind was still, but when she looked up, she could see a light breeze blowing at the treetops. It was as if someone had paused all motion inside the perimeter, a place with its own sense of time. Clarissa took a step forward. Something crunched under her feet. Looking down, she saw a white object poking out of a patch of grass. She knelt down to inspect further and saw, was that bones? They were small, so they weren't human bones, but they were definitely bones. Now that she knew what she was looking at, she could see them everywhere. A few feet away, half hidden under the moss, the skull of some creature stared up at her with empty eye sockets, as if to say, "Turn back." She looked to the left and the right, and there were more bones ringing the edge of the meadow in a narrow band, as if marking a boundary. She swallowed, the lump growing in her throat, and crossed over the threshold and into the meadow where her skateboard lay. 3. She focused on her skateboard. It lay a few yards inside the meadow. It was odd, because from above the hill, it looked like the boy and her skateboard were lying next to each other, just at the edge of the trees. Several yards further inside lay the boy who had taken her skateboard. She crept toward the unmoving form as if she was the thief and they had swapped roles. A sense of urgency filled her like some unwanted insect crawling on the inside of her body. The fear rooted her to the spot. Something was opening, awakening, stirring as if it had slumbered for 1,000 years. She trembled. Clarissa took a breath and remembered what Margie, the older girl who had taught her how to skateboard, always said. "You can't stop being afraid, but that doesn't mean you should give in to fear." Clarissa repeated it to herself under her breath several times. It helped. She was being ridiculous. She needed her skateboard. It was hers, not the thief's, so why couldn't she shake the idea that she was the thief? Why, as she took step after step toward her prized possession, did the thought grow? Clarissa had done nothing wrong, or at least the little shove she had given the boy hadn't seemed like a big deal. A wave of dread hit her. It was unlike anything she had ever felt. Clarissa told herself she would just grab the board and go. The boy would be fine, wouldn't he? She could call 911 when she got out of the woods. The boy was too big for her to lift anyway. Determined to keep going, she clenched her fist and flinched with the pain. Her right hand hurt. She looked down, and there on her palm was blood. A lot of blood. It had dribbled down her arm and was still bleeding. In the center of her hand was a large gash. What had been on the boy's jacket that could cut such a deep wound? She felt the pain when she shoved the thief, but she had no idea that she had torn a hole in the center of her hand. Some of her blood dripped onto the ground. She followed the drops and saw that as soon as they hit the ground, they vanished, as if the ground below was thirsty, eager for a drink. Compelled to do it without thinking, she held out her hand and let the blood drip on the ground on purpose. The hard dirt between the grass swallowed up the moisture almost instantly. She didn't like it. It made her feel ill and amplified that sense of wrongness. She needed that board back. Then she could leave. As she got closer to the boy, her plan hit a snag. Something was wrong. The thief still lay unmoving. That stillness disturbed her. Something in her memory stirred just below the surface. Her father's face flashed with a bubbling well of unease, but she pushed the memory down. If the boy wasn't moving, she couldn't just leave him there, could she? She would have to wake him up and help him find his way out. It was the right thing to do. It was something her father would want her to do. She approached her board slowly, feeling fear grow with every step. The closer she got, the harder her heart pounded. There was the mingling of the deepest kind of curiosity and dread as she inched closer. She reached down and grabbed her board. For a moment, she thought it would be best to turn and run back up the hill, but something beckoned. She took a few steps toward the center. "Hello?" There was no response. The meadow swallowed the echoes like it had swallowed her blood. Clarissa said to the unmoving form, "You know, you got what you deserved falling down that hill. You shouldn't have tried to steal my board." Still no response. "Hey, did you hear me?" She practically shouted the words. Nothing. Clarissa took a few steps closer, raising her board up like a club. If he was faking or playing some kind of trick, she'd be ready. Then she was standing over him. "Hey, I'm talking to you, thief!" The boy didn't stir. And then she noticed something else. One of his limbs was bent in an unnatural direction. Truth hit her in the gut. All hope and light and laughter drained out of her. The reason his quiet disturbed her so much was because his chest wasn't rising and falling. Now, her memory of that terrible night where she had lost her father surfaced. The paramedics had broken down the door, and for one moment she had glimpsed between the two men and saw her father's body. Her father had lain still, just like the boy in front of her. Clarissa's heart beat like drums in the darkness. Her limbs shook for a moment, and she almost collapsed, but then caught herself. Her voice quavering, uncertain. "Hey, this isn't funny anymore. You already stole my board. Knock it off, okay?" She prodded his body with her foot. It twitched. She jumped back, an electric surge of terror. There was a smell, a terrible smell, like a mixture of shit and rotting garbage, but somehow sickeningly sweet, too. She gagged. She covered her face with her hand and said, "Come on, seriously, knock it off. I didn't mean to shove you down the hill. I swear, I didn't even know there was a hill. I... Before she could finish, the earth groaned like thunder below her feet. The wind woke to a gale, and she struggled to stand. Then a loud crack, like the sound of 1,000 trees snapping their trunks at once, echoed through her ears. Pain spiked, and there was total silence, except for a terrible ringing. She felt something wet and sticky flow from her ears and reached up to see what it was. She looked down at her uninjured hand in amazement. More blood. The world set about tearing itself apart. Wind uprooted trees and cast them into the sky like twigs. The wind walled her in, blowing in circles around her and the thief. She was in the center of a storm. Bones and branches and leaves and dirt encircled them, flying madly through the air. The ground shook across the meadow. The earth cracked and danced up and down like someone was slamming their fist into a jigsaw puzzle. Clarissa shouted for help, but the wind swallowed her breath and all the echoes. Feeling dizzy, she fell to her knees. She couldn't get enough air. Her body felt weak. It was growing harder and harder to keep her eyes open. Then, in a blink, everything stopped. The ground stilled. The wind quieted. The dead silence of the meadow returned as if someone had scooped all the noise out and left nothing behind. Cracks in the earth sealed up, and the bones paused in midair and fell back in the exact spots where they had laid before. Clarissa gasped and drank in the air. She took several more long, slow breaths and looked around. Where had all the color gone? All she could see were shades of gray and odd shapes in the dark. She looked down at her clothing. Clarissa had been wearing a red shirt and blue jeans, but now the color was gone. Even the purple flames on her skateboard were gray. There was a long silence. She tried to say something, but there were no words, no noises anymore, not even from her own mouth. She tried to scream, but though she could feel her throat tear from the effort, no noise emerged. A thrumming sensation began. It started at her feet and spread through her body as it reached her mind. Then the noise returned, though it was still without its echo. The thrumming continued, the meadow's heart beating. "Hello?" She didn't know who she was saying hello to. The boy couldn't hear. He was dead. But there was someone there. Every goose pimple on her exposed flesh raised in attention, and her heart pounded, synchronizing with the thrumming of the meadow. It was coming. What that meant, she didn't know. But Clarissa knew it, as sure as if someone had said the words out loud. "Is someone there?" Her voice trembled. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the boy move. She turned her head, and staring, she saw him move again. Was she wrong? Was he still alive? A glimmer of hope flashed in the colorless dread. She leaned down next to the boy, and the smell returned. She gagged again, almost dry heaving. "Hey, are you okay? Say something if you're okay, or just move your arm if you can't speak." She reached down and touched the boy's back, placing her flat palm where his heart would be. He was cold. How could he be so cold? The oppressive heat of summer still lingered. She withdrew her hand as if avoiding some trap or the jaws of a predator. "Please be okay," she said in a whisper. All pretense of anger, all sense of justice had vacated her heart. She wanted only for the boy to stand up again, even if he was a jerk. Clarissa wanted them to walk out of this terrible place together. She didn't want to be alone. Something was coming, and they had to move fast. She took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do, but she didn't like it. The thought of putting her hands on him again disturbed her. She felt dirty even placing a single open palm on his back. Clarissa steadied herself, thinking of Margie's words. She didn't have to let the fear take control. Then she reached her hands down under him and felt the coldness press against her fingers. She turned him over with significant effort. He was bigger than she was by a head. After a moment of pushing, he rolled over onto his back, and she watched with horror as the body flopped over, exposing the truth to the sky. She saw his face, saw the condition of his body, and stumbled backward. Then Clarissa tried to scramble away like a crab, desperate to put some space between her and the rotting, stinking corpse. She screamed. Still, there was no echo. The remainder of the boy's face was frozen in a terrifying, haunted expression. His mouth was open wide, almost as if someone had used fishhooks in the corner, pulling it up to a maddening, terrified smile. The left side of his face that was pressed into the dirt was partially decayed. Bits of muscle and bone peeked through the patches where the skin no longer existed. There were claw marks down the center of his face, crossing the cavities that were once his eyes. Maggots crawled from each of the sockets, working their way around his face. There was no blood anywhere, and she knew that the earth had drunken up his blood, as it had hers. Clarissa shuddered. Hugging her legs, she wept onto her knees. She closed her eyes. She knew that if she closed her eyes and took some deep breaths, the scary things would go away. Her father had taught her that. This couldn't be real. She needed to reset her brain because it was playing tricks on her. That was all. Clarissa opened her eyes. The body was still there. She was still in this creepy meadow, and her skateboard lay a few feet from the boy's body where she had dropped it. She had almost forgotten about it when she had turned the boy over. Nothing happened for several minutes. Panic faded and reason reasserted itself. She didn't understand. How could this be? The boy had only fallen moments ago, and though she was young and had never seen a decayed body before, besides a few scary movies she had watched at Monica's, she knew there was no way the boy's body should be like this already. It had only been a few minutes. Or had it? She thought of how time had passed as she ran through the woods. Maybe time was different here? "Okay, I gotta tell someone. I gotta get help." Clarissa wasn't talking to anyone in particular, but the thought of telling someone, especially since she had pushed the boy, was almost as daunting as staying here with a corpse through the night. The darkness was spreading, and the last slivers of light were disappearing into the trees around the meadow. She didn't know where she was or how long it would take her to find her way back. How could it come to this? Stuff like this always happened to her. Well, maybe not quite like this, but something always turned her world upside down. First, her father had died, then her grandmother, then her stepdad had moved in. All she wanted to do was to pass the time with her best friend and her skateboard. But the darkness would brook no argument. It was coming, and she had to get out of here. She sensed somewhere, way down deep inside, that there were far more dangerous things in this meadow than teenagers playing their games of mischief. Clarissa swallowed, stood up, grabbed her board from next to the boy, and slowly backed away. She didn't know who she was going to tell, but before she could tell anyone, she had to find her way back. She took a few steps to go, and just as she did, the wind started up again. Across the meadow, she heard some rustling in the trees and underbrush. She turned toward it, but now it was too dark to see anything, and she didn't have a flashlight. "Hello?" She sounded like a parrot to herself, but there was no answer, no echo. "Excuse me, I'm lost. Can you help me find my way back home?" Branches cracked and popped on the other side of the meadow, just beyond her vision. She could only see faint outlines of the trees on the other side, skeletons in the colorless dark. She thought of the bones in the ground. The cold crept into her, and she hugged her skateboard, desperate for warmth and light. "Please, I need help. This boy fell and—" A long, loud groan, almost a growl, filled every corner of the meadow. It sounded almost human, almost animal, but it was neither. Terror filled every cell, and she realized that, just like in a dream, she could not move. Her legs felt heavy, her arms dead weight, her mind froze, unable to do anything but listen to the reverberation of noise. Something in her was screaming, begging her to run, to move, to do anything but stand here. Long, loud, labored breaths emerged from the other side of the meadow. There were more snaps of twigs, and the wind gusted as a strange black mist rose and ate all the light that was left. She shouldn't have been able to hear the noises over the wind, but the wind seemed to carry it right to her ears. A strange glow grew in the dark and permeated the meadow. With the dim light, a shadowy form, just barely visible, entered the other side of the clearing. Clarissa felt warmth and wetness between her legs as her bladder let go. Somehow the sensation of her urine running down her leg unfroze her, and with her skateboard in hand, she finally felt the legs unfreeze, and she sprinted back up the hill from where she came. She didn't dare look back. It followed.